Hey everyone, thanks for showing up. My name is Adina and I'm part of the Psychoinformatics lab in INM7. And I'm standing here today to talk a bit about data management with a software tool called DataLad. This is intended as a smallish workshop, and for everyone who has their computers with them, you are invited to code along once we reach that step in this workshop. For the first parts, I'm just going to talk a bit over a couple of slides. Later on, you can decide whether you want to follow along or not, but there will be materials for you to revise everything that I'm going through as well at any later point. So, let me start by motivating a bit why we are here or why I am standing here talking. When we talk about research data management, what do we mean by research data? In principle, it's every single digital object that is involved in your data analysis project, in your science. That can be code, be that code that you wrote yourself or code that you got from others or from the internet. Software tools, either you wrote them yourself or you're just using them in their specific versions. The raw data that you base your analyses on, or the process data that you either create or base your analyses on. The results of your science up to the published manuscript, all of that is research data. And each of these objects needs to be properly managed, and not only once, but throughout its entire life cycle. It's starting from basically designing a study, from the creation of a research data object to its use, to its publication, to sharing the research object with others, archiving it, reusing it, destroying it, and so forth. So this graphic by the JSC details a bit how impressive the research data management lifecycle is. It's basically throughout the entire lifecycle of a research data object that you have to take care of it. And the reason why research data management is made important is not because there is some, say, this bureaucrat somewhere who imposes that upon you, but because research data management is actually a key component for reproducibility, for efficiency, and for the reach and impact of your data science project. So research data management should be something that every one of us should be fairly concerned with. And I want to give you a couple of examples or demonstrations on why you might be motivated to care about research data management. This is a metaphor for a common paper when it is published. This beautiful mermaid is the paper as it is presented to the readers of your publication, and they can see the wonderful science that you've created. Everything lines up and everything is pretty. But behind every paper, there is usually a project directory somewhere on a computer or on a compute cluster, and that does not look by far as pretty as the finished manuscript. Instead, it is usually a somewhat more or less chaotic assembly of data, of code, of results, and it can be quite hard to understand what had been done to what type of research data object in this directory, at which point, by which person, and it can be even harder to recreate that data. I'm fairly convinced that each and every one of us was once in their lifetime pointed to some directory on some computer where they were told there is work by some other person, please go understand it, and then they spend days, if not weeks, trying to figure out what exactly happened in this directory. And I'm also quite confident that each and every one of us has directories like this, that if they would share them with me, I would need a significant amount of time to understand what was going on in these directories if I don't have access to your brain. And the last thing I'm also still quite confident about is that every one of us has a directory on their computer that maybe is a couple of months or years old, but they themselves, even though they created it, would have problems understanding what exactly was done in this project directory. So if we can manage to keep our directories in which we perform our computations and our projects a little bit more clean, then we can ease the effort that it takes to understand and recreate scientific analysis quite a lot. The reason why this is a good thing is that it aids the reproducibility of our science. If I'm able to understand what collaborators or other researchers have done in an analysis, then I'm able to work faster. If I'm able to recreate scientific results, I am also able to increase the reproducibility of our field. And this is why funders and publishers start to require appropriate research data management practices. And this is also why scientific peers increasingly expect research data management from researchers. And finally, as a completely self-motivational aspect, it obviously increases the quality and efficiency of our own work if we care appropriately about research data management. And if those reasons are not enough to convince you, then let me give you one final point here. In neuroscience, we are in the lucky situation that there are some amazing datasets that are being made publicly available. The largest of them is probably the UK Biobank, which is a really cool dataset. The problem is that this dataset is incredibly large. Its orders of magnitude larger than previous public datasets. And if we don't approach datasets of that size with good data management practices, or rather with not naive data management practices, then we will not be able to work with these datasets in the way we want to. Because the computational workflows and the data management practices that we might be applying will just not scale to these sizes. But research data management is quite difficult. It's usually not a skill that is taught in graduate programs or in studies. So as researchers that operate with big data, we are faced with this difficult task that it is really hard to get a hang on if you never received any formal training. And what I'm going to talk about today boils down to two tools or concepts that I think are a great start for improving your own research data management workflows. And the first is version control, and the second is automatic provenance capture. And if these two concepts are something that we can, if these are two things that we can do personally as researchers in our work, then our personal research data management improved greatly, in my opinion. So who here knows what version control is? Who uses a version control tool? That's half of the audience. That's great. For everyone who didn't raise their hand for the first question, let me briefly introduce what version control is. I like this comic because I like it whenever I explain version control. What you can see here is the standard graduate student, and he proudly saves his manuscript draft with the file name final.doc. And then after a couple rounds of revisions, this poor graduate student does not have a single manuscript draft, but he has probably 35. They each differ a bit after each round of revision, but the only thing that can somewhat indicate what has changed is an increasingly complex file name in this rather messy directory. But if we use a version control tool, then just as, for example, is the process with Wikipedia pages, we can track the changes that have been made to a document so that we can associate the type of the change, the date, and the author of the change, and have a history of changes that are associated with a single file instead of a bunch of files in a directory. And the cool thing is that we can also interact with the history of the file and, for example, check out previous stages of the file or revert the file to a previous state. Version control can thus help to keep things organized and keep track of changes. But one of the shortcomings of version control tools like Git is that it is made to only work with small size data. So it's really useful, really handy if you want to write a manuscript, if you are developing code and you keep track of your software development, but it is not made to work with large data. You cannot take your neuroimaging dataset and put it into Git. Then your Git directory will barf and die, probably. depending on how large the directory is, but it can happen quite fast. That is a problem because data is not static. Sometimes we have this misconception that data as it comes from the fMRI scanner or whatever acquisition method we use is just acquired once, and then you get the data, and then nothing changes. You compute a couple of results from that data, sure, but the data is as it is. But this is actually not the case for most data. Most data will change over the course of its lifetime. For example, if you're working in neuroimaging, you might know about the ABCD dataset. And if you have used the ABCD dataset, then you're probably aware that last December there was a mistake reported, a data alert about this dataset, because some directions for field maps for a particular subset of the shared data was mistakenly flipped. This means that the publicly shared data that was distributed in 2019 differs from the data that you can now get after the fix was applied. If we don't have a way of versioning this change in the data, then we can never be sure what kind of input data was the one that produced a particular outcome. And that is a dangerous situation to be in. So we need to version control not only small changing files, but we also need to treat data as a changing entity that we need to version control and appropriately version. And when we talk about provenance capture, then what we mean by data provenance is the question of how did a digital object came to be in its present form. And for provenance, there are a number of applications, but the most important one for us as scientists is that provenance aids the reproducibility of science. And that's related to questions like these. Who generated a research output, and when was that done? Which version of the data was used to produce an output, and where did that data come from? Which script created an output, and which parameters precisely were used, and how was that script executed? What is the software that is relevant for the computation at hand, and what are the interactions of the software with the data or the code that was used? All of that is relevant in order to make a research object reproducible. I need this information to find out how I can regenerate an output, and to be able to regenerate an output. So there is one tool that can help with these concepts that I have just introduced. It can do much more, but I only have 2 hours, and I cannot tell you everything there is, but it can do provenance capture, automatic provenance capture, and version control of arbitrarily sized files, and that tool is called DataLad. It's developed here in the Psychoinformatics lab, and today I want to give a brief introduction on what it is, why one should use it, and how it can be used. And to sum it up in a single sentence, you can say that DataLad is a data management multi-tool. There is not enough space on this slide to list the things that it can do. And it's a very comprehensive software that you can do many things with. The problem that I always face when I want to talk about something that I find to be incredibly helpful, that I want to introduce the coolest features that there are, then I generally lose the person I'm talking to by getting lost in technicalities. So instead of telling you about the coolest thing that there is in DataLad and talking about all of the technicalities, I have decided that I simply want to show you one application in how DataLad can be used. And for this, I want to show you how a reproducible research object can be created by showing you one of the reproducible research objects that I have created. And for this, I'm following this link, and this is something that you can also do. If you have obtained the slide, then you can follow these links, or you can visit the very same GitHub repository that I'm also currently on. The reproducible research object that I have created is a scientific manuscript. So the result of what I'm going to show you in the next 10 minutes will be a PDF that is the general standard scientific PDF with results, with figures, with whatsoever. What I'm showing you here, though, is a GitHub repository. Is everyone familiar with GitHub? That sounds like a yes. I hope. So the cool thing about this repository is that it's on GitHub and that it's publicly accessible to everyone. You can go ahead and take a look at it, as can anyone else with an internet connection and a computer. Okay. The paper I'm talking about was generated on this computer here that is in front of me. It would be a little bit lame if I would show you that I can produce the very same thing that this computer produced another time. So what I'm doing instead is I'm using a different machine, and for this I'm logging into, or I have logged into our cluster, our scientific cluster here at the INM. It's called Useless. And I'm going to do the computations and all of that, all of the demonstrations here on the compute cluster. For this, I'm also going to go on one of our compute nodes, but everything that's happening there is not relevant for what I need to do here. I'm just waiting for the compute node to be allocated to me. Let's see. Cool. Okay, so I'm not going to talk too much what I'm doing. I'm going to pretend that I'm a naive visitor at this GitHub page, and what I will be doing is I'm just following the instructions that were stated here in the README. And the first instruction here is that I should create a virtual environment. If you're familiar with Python, then you probably know virtual environments. You can think of them as sort of software sandbox. I can create a virtual environment, I can give it a specific name, and inside of this virtual environment I can install specific software modules, so that I can make sure that the software that I need is installed, but that the software also doesn't interfere with any of the system side packages that are installed on the system I'm using it. So what I have done here is that I've created a virtual environment. I've called it Remodnav. The reason for this is mainly because this paper is about an algorithm that is called Remodnav, but this is just a name. And I've entered this virtual environment. You can see this because in front of my little prompt, I now have an indicator which virtual environment I'm in. And what I'm doing now is I'm going to create the software environment that I need. And I'm just following the README here. It tells me to install 3 things. Remodnav, this is a Python package that this paper is about. Seaborn, it's a library I need for plotting of the figures inside of my paper. And then lastly, the tool DataLad. Now once that is done, I have created a computational environment in which I can start to work. In virtual environments, I can even make sure to install specific versions of Python packages if I want to. And later in this workshop, I will also show you that you don't need to instruct anyone to install specific things. With DataLad, you can also make sure to actually ship the software environment that you need together with the code or data that you want to share. So the last thing that I'm doing is that I'm going to get a copy of this dataset. And I'm going to do this by just git cloning this repository. Anyone who is interacting with Git and GitHub knows that this is a standard Git command, and that as long as you have Git installed, you are able to do the same thing that I'm currently doing. So with a git clone, I'm obtaining a copy of the repository that is hosted on GitHub onto the machine that I'm currently using. And now I can spend some time explaining the contents or exploring the contents of this repository, because currently this repository doesn't look like any research object at all, especially not like a PDF, because not a single file in this directory is a PDF. What you can see is that there is a code directory and that there is a script in this. So yes, this repository at least seems to share code. There also is a data repository. However, at this moment, it looks like these data subdirectories are empty. There's also an image directory which looks like it should contain figures for a scientific manuscript, but also these things are quite empty. The rest are the sources for LaTeX files. Now, without further ado, I'm just going to run a single command that the README also instructs me to do, which is the last thing I need to do to create or recreate the scientific output that I'm sharing here, and that is make. And while this is happening, it will produce a lot of output, and I will narrate a bit what you will be seeing while it creates all of this output. So in order for me to share a reproducible research object, I, as a researcher, need to make sure a couple of things. First of all, I need to share my code. Then second of all, I need to share the data that is relevant to use the code to produce the results that I'm claiming I have produced. That means that this repository needs to be able to share both of that. You have seen that I'm sharing the code in a GitHub repository, just as you can do with regular code. What is happening in the background while this runs and prints some algorithm details as it's processing things with the progress bars that you might have seen in the beginning, it is downloading data that I need. So what is happening is, for this paper, we're using 3 public datasets. 2 of them, I think, are lying on a server in Magdeburg. Another one lies somewhere in Scandinavia because someone else has shared an open dataset. But I don't actually, or you don't actually, need to care about where this data originates from, because tools in the background working are currently taking care of downloading the data onto the machine that you needed. And that without much work, actually. I don't have the time to dive into the details of how this paper works, and you might be thinking this must be an incredibly elaborate setup and a lot of work in the background, but I can assure you that it's actually not, and I will point you to proof that it is actually not. You can see that here is some more data being downloaded, and everything that is outputted here is freshly generated outputs for the manuscript. The data that we're working in this paper with is eye tracking data. This is really small size data. The advantage of this is that I can demonstrate it during a talk, and it only needs a couple of minutes to compute. If I would be doing this with neuroimaging data, then that would be just as possible as with eye tracking data. It would just take a week to compute, and it's thus not as easily done and showcased during a talk. But there are papers out there that share gigabytes of neuroimaging data along with the code, and then you can run just the same small set of commands to automatically obtain the data that they want to apply their code to. What you can see here now is some plotting and rendering of the data that of the figures that I have computed, and now LaTeX is compiling the LaTeX sources. And if I take a look at this thing now, the size of my repository has increased a bit. Importantly, there is a file called main PDF, which is actually the PDF manuscript that I've compiled. And what you can see if I take a look, for example, at the image directory, is that there are freshly computed results that haven't existed before I cloned this repository. I don't have a PDF reader on the cluster, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to download this thing and show it to you here. But this is how this research object looks after it's compiled. So it's a standard paper. The paper contains tables with numerical results and contains figures that are embedded in this manuscript. And the beautiful thing about this, completely independent of the content of the paper, is that you are able to obtain this repository completely freely available and can validate whether the claims I'm making in this paper that you might have found published in some journal are actually sound. You can also say, hey, I have a improvement to suggest. You can get the code and you can try it out, or you can see whether the code also runs on different data, or what happens if the data changes. So let me quickly show you. Let me quickly go back to my slides. I'm going to keep the terminal and the slides right next to each other for the rest of this talk. And I'm a bit sorry that I don't have all the time that I would want to talk about the details about how this reproducible research object works, but I have written it up. So if you're interested in how this thing works, and I can assure you that it's a surprisingly easy task, there is a step-by-step instruction with code examples. So if you're interested, you can read this. It's a single page, and then create something like this yourself. The most astonishing aspect of this paper for me, however, is not that I can generate a PDF manuscript from scratch. That is okay, it's a nice LaTeX and make gimmick. What I find especially cool is that I'm able to share my data alongside with my code on a page such as Git. So I have a vastly simplified procedure to make my science available to whoever I want. And in the wake of my talk, I'm going to come back a couple of times to showcase some advanced principles that I'm going to talk about with the example of this repository here, so that you can see a couple of things in there. But this post has the complete write-up of how this is done. So let me summarize what DataLad is in brief. The most important thing is that it is a command line tool. It means whenever I want to interact with something that is DataLad, I do this in a terminal and then append a command to it. It's available for all major operating systems. So whether you use Linux, Mac OS, OS X, or Windows, you can use it. It's especially cool though if you are on Linux, so it's very useful on a scientific cluster. DataLad is built on top of two tools, Git and Git Annex. Those tools are version control tools. And you can see that this is a version control tool because this repository here has, just as any Git repository, a version history or a history, and I can find out what has happened to this repository at which time during its creation. And the beautiful thing about such a Git history is that I can, first of all, know about this. You can know about it if I share my repository with you, and I can interact with this history. So if I don't like a change that was done, I can revert it, for example. Okay. With DataLad, you can version control arbitrarily large content. So with DataLad, you don't need to care about how large or what type of data you have. You can just version control it. You can easily share and obtain data. And you can create computational reproducible data analysis that you can then share. And DataLad in general is completely domain agnostic. So you can use it not only for neuroscience, you can also use it to manage your personal music library. And this is why the examples that I'm going to talk about are also mostly domain agnostic, but it will be a very good exercise, and I assume quite easy to see if you to think about how you can take a domain agnostic example and then relate it to whatever use case you may have for data management. So what I'm going to do today are introducing some basic concepts and commands. There is not much time to dive into the details of everything, and there are also a lot of other things that this tool can do, but I only have 2 hours. But if you're interested in more, then you can read the DataLad handbook. The DataLad handbook is a free and open source online book. You can visit this webpage, and you can also obtain a PDF copy of it. And we have created the DataLad handbook, and we continue to expand it to give people interested in DataLad and in data management a complete educational course on everything that you can do with it. The handbook consists of two parts. One is two major parts. One is the basics. That's an educational course, so to say, so that you have a continuous narrative that you can work through self-paced. The narrative in this book is domain agnostic, so it's actually envision yourself as a student in a college course on DataLad that is called DataLad 101. And in the wake of this course, you create a dataset and you collect some readings and version control them. You make notes about things that you learn and so forth. You have a midterm project in which you need to submit a data analysis project. We're going to see some of that later during the code demonstrations. And then there's a second part that is called the use cases, and these use cases, among them is also the reproducible paper. They detail step-by-step instructions on how to solve common data management problems. And those are shorter and less technical, but they give an overview of the things that are possible with DataLad. So if you're interested in learning more than I can talk about today, just check out the handbook and you can find all of the content for yourself. And also, please don't hesitate to ask any questions. Whatever is on your mind, just ask it and I will try to answer as best as I can. Cool. So the first thing I want to talk about is the core concept of DataLad. The core concept of DataLad is a dataset. And you have seen a dataset already because, among others, it's this Git repository that I cloned. A dataset can be any directory that is managed by DataLad. And this means that any directory on your computer can be managed by DataLad. You can either install datasets. You have seen that when I cloned the repository on from GitHub and installed it locally on the cluster, or you can create them from scratch and collect some inputs inside of them. And you can nest them. I will show you later what this precisely means, but for now you can think of nesting as linked subdirectories in a dataset or in a directory. And in order to experience a dataset, I'm now going to do some live code demonstrations. And if you want to follow along, then you can use your computer now. And there is a part of the handbook that has all of the code that I'm going to execute listed as well. So if you want to follow along, then you can go to handbook.datalad.org, then scroll all the way to the bottom. And then there is the section code lists from chapters. And what I'm going to start with is code from chapter 1, the dataset basics. And then you will find code snippets in a numbered list. And you can just take the code snippet and copy it into a terminal to execute it. You will see that all of these code snippets are numbered in the output that you're going to be seeing on the terminal that I will show you. You will see that I also have the code snippet numbering so that you can orient yourself a bit. And the way I'm going to do all of that is via a remote control terminal so that I can kind of try to focus while I'm doing it. So let me quickly set this up. Is there a question up to this point? Cool. Okay, so what I'm also going to do is I'm going to do all of that on the cluster because that is it has a faster internet connection than the wireless here. Okay, cool. So the code that I'm using comes from the DataLad handbook. This is why we're following a domain agnostic and educational narrative. You have to bear with me with that, but I'm sure it's easy to relate what I'm doing to what you need to be doing. And we will start the narrative by creating a dataset. And to create a dataset, there is a single command that you need to execute, and that is the DataLad create command. The only required argument that the DataLad create command has is a path with the name of the directory you want to create. So in this case, I'm naming a dataset DataLad 101. What you can see in this command as well is a configuration option with the -c flag. It's called text to git. I don't have the time to cover exactly what this configuration does, but it's one of several configurations that you can use to create suitable default behaviors for your dataset depending on the situation you want to use it for. If I execute this command, then DataLad will create a new repository for me. You can see here that DataLad creates some output and a summary of the outcome of a command. In this case, we can see that the command create ran and that the outcome of this command was okay. If I now navigate into this directory and just list the outputs with the ls command, then I will not be seeing any output because this directory is created empty. The cool thing that I talked about, though, is that datasets have a revision history. And we can take a look at this revision history by using Git tools, because a dataset is simultaneously a Git repository, and you can use any Git command of your choice to work with it as well. And you can explore the history, the version history it has, with tools, for example, as git log. So if I take a look at what the current version history of my dataset is, then this is as small as a dataset's history can be. But I'm going to use it to introduce everyone who is not familiar with a view like this into what we're seeing here. So what we're seeing here are two entries in our history. Each of these entries is identified with this 40 character sequence. This is referred to as a checksum or a hash, and it is one way to identify a so-called commit, so a single entry in your history. You can see that there is an author associated with the entry in the history, and you can see that there is a date and a time at which this particular change took place. And the last thing you can see in this view is that there is what is called a commit message. This is a human-readable description that you should usually create to make it easier for a human, upon first seeing your history, to make sense of what has happened. In these two cases, I haven't written the commit message, but it was DataLad, and currently it's also not entirely clear what these commit messages mean, but the next commit messages will be, we will be writing for ourselves. Okay. The reason, yes?
So DataLad does submission to the normal Git stuff, and they automatically put this tag before, or should I remember DataLad also?
You mean this DataLad tag?
Yes.
Yeah, that is created by DataLad. Yes, for most of the things that DataLad does, it will prepend a large DataLad thing. There are commands for which DataLad will produce automatic commit messages, but for the next few things that we will do, we will create them ourselves. But you will also see more generated by DataLad. Okay, so the reason why we have this history is because there are a couple of tools working in the background. If we list also the hidden contents in this directory with the -a flag to the list command, then we can see that there are a couple of hidden directories and files. In this case, it's the .datalad directory and the .git directory and the .git attributes file. It is not relevant to understand what is inside of these directories to use it. The only thing that one should keep in mind is you should delete them. So let's work with this dataset. The first thing we want to explore is how to put data inside of this dataset and to then version control it. For this, we're staying with the educational narrative, and we're just going to download some PDFs for a reading list. And for this, I'm going to create a directory. I call it books, so that my dataset currently consists only of an empty directory. And what I will do then is I'm just going to download a couple of books from the internet and save them into this books directory. I'm doing all of that from the command line because it allows me to remote control this terminal. But obviously you can also visit this web page, click on download, then save the PDF into the dataset of your choice. I'm just doing it because I like the terminal. So what is happening now, I'm using the wget command to download this two PDF files, and then I will save them under two names, tlcl.pdf and bytefpython.pdf, into my books directory. Here you can see where they are. And the question is, what does DataLad now think about this new content in my dataset? I can query the state of a dataset with the dataless status command. And this will report on content that is untracked, modified, or in any other way not clean. And in this case, it will report that we have an untracked directory. If you're more familiar with Git tools, then you can just as well also use the git status command to do this. DataLad status has a slightly different way of reporting, and in some ways is more powerful, in some ways it's less useful than git status. So in order to, at this point, the books in my directory are untracked. This means that they are not part of the history of my dataset yet, and instead, DataLad just reports that there is content that it is basically not aware of, because the dataset content needs to be consciously added to the dataset in order for it to be version controlled. And in order to version control any content in your dataset, you need to give it to the DataLad save command. The DataLad save command will work as is. It doesn't have required arguments, but it is very helpful if you attach a commit message to the DataLad save command. If you do that with the -m option, and just with a git commit message, you try to append a concise and human-readable description of the change that you are doing to the dataset. Now, if I do DataLad save with just a commit message, then you will again see a nice status summary of the command, and you will see that there will a successful save operation in our dataset. And now I can take a look at how this looks in the history of the dataset. So what we can see here is that here is a new commit. I authored this commit, and here's the commit message that I attached to it. This down here looks a little bit confusing. It's something that one gets fairly used to easily. But the gist of it is that this entry in the history certifies that I have added 2 PDFs to our dataset. So this means that, version control consists essentially of 2 commands if we are using DataLad. You create a dataset with DataLad create, and then you do a change, and you do DataLad save. And those are the 2 commands that are relevant in order to version control files. This is easy enough so that I can spend 5 minutes on talking about best practices for actually doing version control, because you have seen that if I do a DataLad save without any additional arguments, it will save everything that is modified or untracked in my dataset to its history. The powerful thing about a version history in a dataset, as in a Git directory, a Git repository, is that you can interact with the history. But interactions with the history are made especially easy if you save changes in very small and meaningful units. So in this case, as I've done here, I've added 2 books, and they don't have that much in common with each other. It would be better if I would save them individually, because that would allow me to revert the addition of the book to my dataset easily later, because I want to make sure that I have a small change in my dataset. If you're developing code, then you would also save only those code changes that are a meaningful unit, and not simultaneous work on 2 unrelated scripts, because that would make it very hard to revert such changes in the future. Okay, so to introduce some best practices, I'm just going to download another book. So I'm using again the wget command, and now I'm downloading another PDF to save it in there. And what I can do now is I can show you how to save a singular change that was made to the dataset. I can do this. So first I query DataLad status, what it thinks about it. It says I have an untracked book in this directory. And now I can use the DataLad save command and append a path to the change that I want to commit, and then do a DataLad save. If I would have more modifications in my dataset at this point, then only the path that I'm specifying would be saved. Okay. However, this is still a little bit suboptimal because I obtained something from the web. And at this point, I'm the only one who knows where this book came from. And this doesn't need to be a book. It can be, for example, code that you find on the internet or that a collaborator shares with you. So there is no provenance about where that input data came from. And there is a DataLad command that can make sure of capturing the provenance of any file that you add to your dataset that comes from the web. Yes, okay, I'm going to check out the Git log again. And that is the DataLad download URL command. So if you have something that comes from the web, then you can put the URL into the DataLad download command, specify the dataset that you want to save it in. In this case, it's the current dataset. This is where there is dataset dot, which is the Unix expression for this dataset I'm currently in. I can append a commit message and then also a path to where I want to save whatever I'm downloading it to. And if I execute this, then DataLad will take care of downloading the content that I specify with the URL, secretly reporting where this content came from so that it is embedded in the data set information, and then also make sure to save it to my history. So if I now check out what is in books, I have 4 PDFs, and if I do a DataLad status now, I have a clean dataset status. You can see that it is clean because the DataLad status command does not return anything. Okay, so this was data that doesn't frequently change. Usually we don't change PDF files. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to show you how to version control things that frequently change. What I'm doing here, all in the wake of this educational narrative, I'm creating a notes.txt file. For your own use cases, this can be a code script that you keep developing. And again, here I'm going to go a detour to do all of that in a terminal. I'm using here documents for that allow me to just take text and put it into a file from the terminal. But you can just use any editor of your choice, write code, save your script file that you have done with any GUI or editor, and then continue. I'm just doing it to use the terminal. So if I execute this here document, I have created a file notes.txt, and this is the content of it. This is the only thing that I'm doing with this rather convoluted statement in the terminal. So if I now do a DataLad status, I will have an untracked file in my dataset as expected. And in order to save this file, I'm just using the DataLad save command with a meaningful commit message. Now, this file is known to my dataset. Now I'm just going to append some more nodes to my file. In this case, I'm going to append a node on how DataLad save works. If I modify this file, by appending this additional node to it, I will see that the state of this file in my dataset is not untracked, but it is modified. Because comparing the previously tracked state of nodes.txt and the current state will show that there's a difference for DataLad and also for Git. And in order to save this modification, I can just do another DataLad save. So that's it. And if I now take a look at the history of my dataset, then my history will not only show me that I have done 2 nodes in my nodes.txt file, but handily it will also directly summarize, or rather show the changes that have been done to this text file. And that's quite handy. Okay, so this means, to just give a quick summary of where we are at, by creating a dataset, you have a directory on your computer in which you can version control datasets, contents of any size if you want to. You can do this by just adding data or modifying existing data in the dataset and then running DataLad save. If you save meaningful units of change and attach a helpful commit message, then you can also be very helpful to any human consumers of your dataset. But in principle, version control is two commands, create and save. So for a quick summary, you can create a dataset with DataLad create. You can apply configurations, even though I don't have time to talk about them. There are some that create meaningful and useful defaults of dataset behavior. A dataset has a history to track files and modifications to them, and you can explore them with Git tools or external tools. You can save the state of the dataset or individual modifications with DataLad save, and you should make sure to use concise commit messages for human consumptions to describe the change that you're doing. then the DataLad download URL is a convenient helper to download contents from the web, save them to the dataset automatically, and also record their origin as well. DataLad status is the command that you would frequently turn to get an update of the current state of the dataset. And with just these two commands, or these few commands, you get from here to this. So instead of having a chaotic directory in which you rely on file namings, you have a orderly version control dataset. And especially if you're not used to using Git, or if you have students that are not used to using Git, this is a very fast and very easy way to get version control going. However, version control is only one aspect of data management, and so I'm going to dive a bit deeper into what DataLad can do, and I will show you how one can consume datasets, and that is obtain a shared copy of a dataset. And for this, continuing in this educational narrative, I'm going to show you how to obtain a public dataset that is shared via DataLad. And this is a dataset that contains podcasts about a philosophical seminar. It's a very nice podcast. For this, I'm going to make a directory because I want to keep everything clean. And then I'm using the DataLad clone command to obtain the dataset. It is shared on GitHub from this URL. And I want to save it into this path that I'm optionally giving here. So in this newly created directory, I want to have this dataset into a directory or dataset that I call long now. What I'm doing here as well is I'm specifying the dataset I'm doing this in, because I want to link the dataset within my top level dataset. I will show you in a bit why this is really handy to do. If I execute this, the command will download or clone the repository, and afterwards I see that I have more content in this dataset. I'm listing the file hierarchy of this dataset here, and I'm using only the directories because there are a lot of files. But what you can see here is that I have this long now dataset, and this contains two subdirectories. So let's take a look at what the contents of these subdirectories are. If I list them, then there are hundreds of MP3 files. I hope the contrast on the beamer is good enough. So all of these files that you can see listed here are podcast MP3 files. And there are literally hundreds of them inside of this dataset. Now you may be curious how the download of several hundred MP3 files happened so fast, because the download or the clone of this dataset merely took a couple of seconds. The reason for this is that the contents of these files are not present in this current dataset yet. So if I would want to open any of these MP3 files, I would fail. This is a funky concept, but it's incredibly useful. So if I ask this directory how large it is with the du, so disk usage command, then it will tell me it is absolutely tiny. This helps me download this dataset incredibly fast. But if I now query DataLad to tell me what is the total size of the contents that can be in this dataset, then it can tell me for this particular dataset that there are actually more than 15 gigabytes of contents that I can potentially retrieve. If you have a neuroimaging dataset with hundreds of subjects, then it is very helpful to be able to download a very lean and slim dataset in a couple of seconds, and then have metadata availability information on all of these files to see what of the files you are actually needing. So if you have a data analysis project in neuroimaging, you may only want to use the structural data. There's no need to also download terabytes of functional data. With a dataset like that, you can explore the file hierarchy and then only obtain those contents of the dataset on demand by preserving the option to obtain any of the contents that you want. If I want to get a file, then I'm using the DataLad get command. And then in the most simple case, I can just specify a complete directory, or as here, a single file. If I do this, then DataLad will take care of obtaining the data that belongs to this file. You will see that here is a status, get OK, so this command succeeded, and I, as a consumer of this dataset, don't actually need to care where it came from. In this case, it came from a podcast that is published over the web. I can now query how much of the data that is in principle present in this dataset is already downloaded. So you can see that I only downloaded a fraction of the total size. And I can also download a couple of files by just listing them one after another. And what I want to show you here is what happens if I try to get a file that was already retrieved. The first one is the one that I had already retrieved. If I specify a file that is already there again, then DataLad will just not download it. It will say, I succeeded in downloading 2 of the files that you wanted, but the third one was just not needed. You already have it. Cool. So for consuming datasets, this is the file hierarchy here. You can see that we have a sub-dataset inside of this so-called super or top-level dataset. Initially, we only have a very lightweight dataset. It's only small files that are present and metadata information about which files are in principle available. And then afterwards, you can obtain any content. You can also obtain all content at once via DataLad get. The cool thing about this dataset is that this one has a standalone history. So if I now use git log again, then I can find out who was the person who created and shared this dataset. I'm looking here at the beginning of the version history of this dataset, and I can see that Michael Hanke was the one who created this dataset back in 2018. And if I wanted to, I could find out all of the things that this author decided to put into the history of his dataset. But let's find out. So, okay, first of all, we're in an educational course. I'm going to make a note about this. Okay, so now we are in the super dataset, in the dataset that we ourselves created, DataLad 101. And the interesting thing to find out is how does the super dataset see the addition of the sub dataset in its own history. And for this, we can take a look at this commit summary. This is the addition of a subdataset. You can see that there is nothing like the previous lock of the directory that I just showed you. There is nothing about added MP3 files, nothing about Michael Hanke or any author that you're not aware of. It's me that does a change that is a bit cryptically summarized here, but the most important part of this summary is this commit char sign. And I just want you to memorize the first 6 characters of this. It's DCC34F. Because this so-called sub-project commit can be found in the sub-dataset again. So if we navigate into the sub-dataset and then take another good look at the history, we can see that we can find this commit hash that is tracked in the super dataset as being the most recent change in the sub-dataset. This means that we have a record of the precise version state of the subdirectory or sub-dataset in the super dataset. And this sounds a bit abstract, but I'm going to show you what the advantage of that is by going back into my paper. Because while I was... So, first of all, I'm going to show you that this dataset has a couple of subdatasets. Quite a few, actually. When I was writing this paper, I had all of the results computed, and then I was writing the discussion, and I found a paper that reported that in one of the datasets I was using, there was a labeling error in the input data that I used. And I can show you this, because it is a subdataset here. So if I go into this subdataset, this is dataset that was shared by people I actually don't know personally. They made their data publicly available, which is wonderful. So someone called Richard Anderson back in 2016 created this dataset. And then there was a paper that reported a mistake in the data sometime in 2018. And when I found out about this mistake, I went paranoidly back to my own computations and checked, oh God, is that fixed in my data? And I found out that no, the error in the data set is still there. So then in 2019, I contacted the authors via GitHub with a pull request and said, hey, there is a paper that reports a mistake in your data. Here is a fix for that. And they decided that this is something that would be good to be fixed in their dataset, and they integrated this change to their data into their dataset. This means that the data you could download from GitHub in 2019, the most recent version, is different from the data that you would have downloaded in 2018. And that's problematic if you think about this happening to any of your large studies. If you have a dataset, a neuroimaging dataset that you use once to create your results, and then later on a change happens because a mistake, for example, was found and fixed, then this public neuroimaging dataset changes. If then someone else or yourself tries to replicate your results, it is possible that they fail. And if you are not able to point to which version of the dataset your code was using as input, then it will definitely be a very painful experience. For me, I was able to quickly update the current version of the subdataset by having it registered with a specific version. And in this setup, I can even say, okay, compute me my results again with the 2018 data, and let's find out how much changes if I compare it to the 2019 data. So that's an incredibly helpful thing to have. Okay, so let's continue. After a quick additional summary. So if we talk about dataset nesting, then the superdataset, or any top-level dataset, registers the origin of its subdatasets, so where were they retrieved from, where can I find the data that they contain, and that in a precise version. And I have the flexibility to also just set the version I want the subdataset to be in. So as a quick command summary, you can install a dataset with dataset clone. You can either do it on its own, for example, as with the paper repository. There you just need to specify the source. This can be a URL or a path or an open data collection. But you can also install it as subdatasets to register them in a superdataset. And this is where this dataset option becomes relevant. Upon installation of a dataset, you only have small files and metadata, but a DataLad get will then retrieve the actual file content if you decide that you want to have it. This spares you a lot of time and download upon the initial clone of a dataset. You can use DataLad status with the annex and annex all flags to query about the amount of the size of the dataset in total. And datasets preserve the history, and the superdataset records the version of the subdataset. Okay, so what I want to talk about now is how to create a reproducible data analysis with DataLad. I like this comic a lot to introduce reproducible analysis. You have the professor here who points, again, a poor graduate student, to a code directory or project directory that either a person who left the lab years ago or the graduate student himself a couple of years ago created. And what this comic then exemplifies in this exchange here are the instructions for how to use it. Adopted is the code commented, not likely. Where are the files? Who knows? This exemplifies how difficult it can be to recreate and understand what has happened in a data analysis. And I want to show you how this can be mitigated with DataLad, and this is a lot of the automatic provenance capture aspect that I talked about. If you want to follow along, then you can go and check out the code snippets from the 10th chapter. This chapter is called Yoda, and the reason for this is that it also introduces some data management principles for data organization. And those principles are called the Yoda principles. And I need to spend a couple of minutes to give you a rough sketch of what these Yoda principles are for the later things to make sense. So, the Yoda principles are 3 principles that are used for organizational principles for datasets. I'm going to summarize them really quickly here. If you want to do a data analysis, it is beneficial if you keep everything clean and as modular as you can have it. This applies to 2 different dimensions of your dataset, and both are exemplified below. So first of all, you can see in this graphic here the evolution of all parts of a later scientific paper. You can see this is the representation of a single dataset, and they are linked to top or higher level datasets during the process. One of the principles is that you shouldn't touch or modify the raw data when you compute an analysis with them, because that makes it impossible to find out later potentially what has been done. Instead, you want to preserve any input data in its state and then just add the results that you create from them in a new place away from the input data to keep everything clean and modular. So what you can see here, this first data set is the raw data as it comes, for example, from an MRI scanner. You don't use the raw data to work with for a data analysis, so the next transformation that you do is you convert it, for example, to nifties. You convert your DICOMs to nifties and you sort them in the bit standard to make it a nice data set you can use a lot of code with. Now, your nifty files in bit standard are still not the ones that you want to apply your code to. You actually want to pre-process the data. Instead of modifying your bits converted data set, you create a new one with this data set as input data that you run through fMRI prep or any other pre-processing pipeline to get your data pre-processed. And then you have 2 graduate students, each of them does a different analysis, and each of these analysis 1 and analysis B, use the pre-processed data as their input. They simply install it as a sub-data set and then conduct their analysis. And finally, these analysis data sets are again the input of the final paper that your graduate student can then share, just as I was able to share my paper with the world. And from the paper, in principle, one can find out about this whole chain of events, and one can digress if you want to let them. You are the person sharing your dataset. You can make sure how much of the provenance or of the contents of your datasets you actually want to share. You can make sure that you can trace every single step that leads to this paper within your research object that is the paper. And that's a really powerful thing to have. But it requires that you work modularly and clean. What is also part of this is this file hierarchy here. You can see that everything inside of a single dataset here is quite clean. So you have a dedicated code directory in which you have the code and the scripts, or even tests that you can use to test your code. And then you have a dedicated inputs directory in which your data is linked as subdatasets. And instead of modifying these input data directly, you just save them, for example, in an output directory. You can also have some files that are useful for human consumption, for example, a README or docs, and you can also have software environments that you share with it if you want to. But this in general exemplifies how to keep things already significantly more organized than just putting everything in a single directory. Okay, and importantly, in order to make sharing across different computational infrastructures work, everything that you do inside of a dataset needs to be self-contained. So that's a very straightforward thing, but if you develop code, then you obviously need to input relative paths that are based on the dataset you're currently in, and not absolute paths that would make it impossible for your code to run on a different system where you don't have the same paths. Okay, and the next thing is all about provenance capture. because in order to have a comprehensive and reproducible data analysis, you need to record where anything that you got from elsewhere came from, and what you did to it, and also that everything you created yourself from inputs or whatever needs to be properly documented. Which script created what, which data was used, and so forth, and in which software environment was all of that done. And the good thing is that all of that is done by DataLad if you use it appropriately. And I'm going to show you how to do this by continuing a bit further in the book. The narrative then continues with a midterm project, and in the narrative one student needs to submit a data analysis midterm project and later share this. For this we create a subdataset that hosts our data analysis project. I'm going to do this with the DataLad create command again, and I'm giving the name midterm project. But there are two things that I'm applying here. The first is a configuration option that's called Yoda. Yoda is one configuration option that applies very useful defaults to any data analysis dataset. And then I'm also taking care of linking this subdataset to the top level dataset, because I want to have this dataset recorded in my superdataset. If I execute this, then I'm creating inside of DataLad 101 a subdataset that is called midterm project. The next thing that I want to do for my analysis project, and at this point I should probably tell you what type of analysis project I'm doing. I need to go quickly back into the slides again. Yeah, in the narrative I'm just going to do a super simple standard example data analysis. So everyone is probably aware of the iris dataset, where you have for variables length and width of sepals and petals of 3 different species of iris flowers. That's a introductory data science example for classification analysis. So what I want to do in this dataset is I just want to develop a script that does such a classification analysis. So the first thing I want to do is I want to get the input data and link it appropriately. I have made sure that there is input data publicly available. This is on GitHub, and I'm cloning that linked to the midterm project dataset into a directory that I call input. Once this is done, I have linked my dataset to the input it is using. And obviously, you can create your input datasets yourself. If you have a data directory lying around, you can transform an existing dataset, a directory, into a dataset, and then just install it into any analysis dataset that you want. What I'm doing next is, I can quickly show you how this looks like. What I'm doing next is I'm actually developing a script. And again, I'm going to do this with a here document that writes a lot of text into my terminal at this point. It's not super important to understand what is going on here, but it's a simple Python script that does a k-nearest neighbor classification analysis. So what you can see here is basically that I am using the input data, and you can see that I'm using a relative path to refer to that. And then I'm creating 2 outputs from this analysis. One is a PNG file, because the first thing I want to do with my data is plotted, and the next thing is a CSV file, because I want to save the prediction report. And if I save this, or if I execute this, then I have an untracked file in my dataset. This is the script that I've generated in code. I can save this. I can even add a tag, if you're used to that Git concept, to have another nice identifier of the state of my dataset. I call it ready for analysis, because now I have input data and I have my code. And if I save this, then I am able to run this script. The way I would run a Python script from the command line is I use my Python interpreter and then specify a path to the code script that I'm using. But if I would just execute this file, then it would produce all of these outputs, and later on, neither I nor anyone else would have an easy time figuring out how that is done, especially if it's a data analysis that is more complex than this, where you have hundreds of figures and you select one of them to be your final figure for your paper. So in order to capture provenance of a script execution, I can wrap the command that I want to run into what is called a DataLad run command. This command takes a couple of inputs, and it also does more that I'm today having time to talk about. So what you can see here is that the first thing I'm going to give to it is a human readable commit message, where I'm making my life easier in the future to understand what I have done. What I'm then doing is I'm specifying inputs. The input flag also does something very handy. It will make sure to retrieve any file content that is not yet there. So if I have input that comes from a subdataset that is cloned but not yet retrieved, then specifying that will make sure to always have all of the necessary data available that is needed for the computation. And I'm also specifying the output files because the output flag takes care of making files modifiable should I ever want to overwrite them or change them. And the last thing I'm giving to this command, which is the only required argument that this command has, is the command that I want to execute. So I could run Python 3 code script pipe to execute my analysis, but here I'm wrapping it into DataLad run to have DataLad run take care of the provenance capture of everything. So if I run all of that, oh, I think I was not on a compute node. I'm sorry. No, it worked. Great. Okay, so what I did here is I wrapped a normal command execution in my DataLad run command. And this command, you can see in this output here, took care of saving all of the results. And it saved them together with my commit message in my history. So if I take a look at the history now, I can see that here I have a recent commit that is my commit message. And if I take a look at the very last commit here, then you can see this thing. This thing looks a bit weird. I can explain what it is, but it's made for computers and not for humans. You will see later why this is for computers. But this thing is a machine-readable record of what was done and which command was carried out and which results were created by this. I will quickly show you what this command produced by showing you the PNG image that I created. Here it is. So I now, because I don't have any viewer on the cluster I'm using, I just downloaded the PNG file and I can open it and I can say, wow, that's a wonderful figure, great, cool. And I submit my manuscript to a publisher, and then the reviewers say that is all perfect work, but see these colored dots here, they are red and green, and you're being a huge asshole towards anyone with a red and green color blindness. How would they ever will be able to dissociate the two colors? So what you would need to do in this case is you would need to change the color scheme. Let's say this is 9 months after you generated this figure, and it's quite hard to find out what actually happened to this figure. But with the provenance capture, we can find out what was done to this file. First of all, we can query what happened to this thing, and then we can find out which person, if it's a project with many collaborators, that's certainly helpful, created this output when and why and how, depending on how good the commit message is. And we also have a machine-readable record of how it was computed. So if I want to now change the color scheme, which I'm just going to do, sorry. So if I want to change the color scheme, I can go here. And then just say, let's take blues, that's a nice color scheme. I'm going to do a DataLad status on this to see, aha, I have modified my script. I can do a DataLad save, update color scheme to be color blindness friendly. And afterwards, I can have a computer take care of recomputing what I need to recompute. Because if I take a look at my history and check out the identification, the commit hash for the previous DataLad run procedure, I can just copy this commit hash and then plug it into a command that is called DataLad rerun. I can also give a commit message to it. And then I'm going to specify the commit hash. And once I do this, DataLad will take care of finding out how this particular commit in my history was executed, and then it will just recompute everything. And I can show you that this, what this resulted in. Oh man. By just downloading the file again, and I can open it up. And then I see, okay, great, that's blue now, perfect. And that can be a rather complex analysis or an analysis that is just as simple as this one, but you don't need to take care of remembering how you executed and produced this result, because there's automatic provenance that can enable a machine to do your job again after you have done it once. Cool. Yes?
I think I often use the snake which generates about 3,500 files, output files, which I think is a bit unreasonable to expect to write down on the terminal. Is there a way to automatically detect, okay, like I ran this script, check the differences in the repo and consider it output?
Yes, that's how this command works.
Yeah, so the default is for DataLad 1 to detect automatically what was modified.
Okay.
And if that is your concern, you don't need to specify those outputs, as Adina did. Specifying those outputs, which I think should be able to take patterns.
Oh yeah, it does. You can just like say
what
everything.
What that is for is basically the rerun. So to modify the record so that a later rerun can discover, oh, there are already those outputs and I need to create a new version. For that I need to get those files first, make sure I have them and make them writable. Change the output. However, for just recording what a particular call did, DataLad will discover automatically the modification. So,
but not for the rerun.
Oh, also for the rerun. I can show you this in the...
Yeah, but... okay, sure.
I can show you this in the summary, in the commit summary of the rerun. So I have reran the previous executed run command, and this created an entry in my history. But unlike the first run command, where I have, I can show you that, where I have two additions to my dataset. So I can see here, over there are two changed files, the prediction report and the PNG images. If I go and check out what the output of the rerun command produced, it is just the single file that I modified because I adjusted the color scheme, which is the PNG image. So anything that is left unmodified by rerunning a previous command will actually not change. Everything. Oh yeah.
Okay.
The contrast is not that great. I'm sorry. Anything else you want to add to that, Ben?
Yeah, no, not at the moment. So, yeah, if you read documentation about DataLad 1, you will find what you need, and yeah. So auto detection is done.
Okay, so I'm quickly going to continue here with some. Sorry.
But you also had a question, right?
Same question.
Oh, okay. So I'm going to quickly continue here with this narrative, so I can also be kind to humans that obtain my dataset and create a README file, so that others can quickly find out what is the content of this dataset if I publish it to GitHub. That's not entirely relevant to what I want to show you next, but it's just a good practice to also be kind to humans here. Because the next thing that I want to show you is that even though I'm in this dataset sharing data and code, it is not a guarantee that the computations actually succeed. So because first of all, here's a DataLad run summary. So this is how DataLad run works. You have a dataset of one state, and DataLad run manages to capture all of the changes that the execution of any arbitrary command does to the dataset and saves it, both with a human-readable summary if you provide a commit message and with a machine-readable record that enables recomputations done by a machine. It takes care of getting input data if specified, and it can take care of unlocking, but I don't have the time to go into the details of what that exactly is, output files so that they can be modified if someone reruns this command. But if I would share my script with you, then the script may not be able to run because you lack the necessary software environment. Maybe you're not used to Python programming, or maybe you don't have the particular versions of the Python modules that are required. I can show you that by just entering a virtual environment that I know doesn't have the correct software prerequisites. So now I am in a environment that is different from my usual environment, and this environment just doesn't have all of the Python packages I have installed for myself. And if I now do the same DataLad rerun as before, which previously worked, then you will see that this throws an error because module not found, no module named pandas, since this software simply isn't installed. And that's an outcome that I kind of want to prevent if I share my data and code with you. For you as my collaborator or audience, I want to make it as easy as possible to verify my results. So what I can do is, in a DataLad dataset, to also attach a software environment to the computations I'm doing. And I can do this with a DataLad extension. This DataLad extension is called DataLad containers, and by software that is encapsulated in a software container. Is anyone not familiar with the concept of a software container? Cool. So you can, with the DataLad extension, you can take any Docker or Singularity container and register it to your dataset and then ship your dataset together with this container. And I'm going to show you how this is done. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a software container to the dataset. Adding means I'm registering the location of where that software container can be found inside of my dataset. In this case, I have created a Singularity image and put it on Singularity Hub, and it can be found publicly available under this URL. And then I'm just using the DataLad containers add command with a name that I want to give this software environment. Here I'm using midterm software, and I specify the URL that it comes from. If I do that, then the Singularity image will be downloaded and registered to my dataset. This may take a while because the Singularity image is a bit larger than what we previously downloaded, but it's also a very tiny Singularity image because it only contains Python packages. So once this is done, I have a registered container in my dataset. If I take a look at the history, then I can also find out information on this addition to my dataset with this addition to my history. The handbook will explain what the contents of this commit message mean precisely. For now, you have to be satisfied with knowing that it is there. In order to now execute my analysis inside of the software container, I'm using the DataLad containers run command. So instead of using DataLad run, I'm using DataLad containers run. This command is structured exactly as the DataLad run command. The only difference is that I'm giving the container name to the command as well. And if I execute this, and remember I'm in an environment that doesn't have the necessary Python prerequisites installed, then DataLad will take care of executing my script inside of the software environment that I forgot something. What has happened? Oh, yeah, right, because the previous command did not execute cleanly. That left some modifications in my dataset. I'm going to get a clean dataset. Okay, so now I can run this command. If you want to get the details into why was that run command currently impossible, I have to refer you to the handbook. But now that I can attach a software container to my computation, I am able to execute this computation even though I don't have the correct software in the environment I'm currently in. And that's a really handy tool because this allows me to give you everything to recompute and verify and work on and collaborate on the results that I want you to have. So as a final summary here, this is a summary of the DataLad containers run command. And in addition to everything the DataLad run command can do, it can also register a Singularity or Docker container that either lives on your system or in any other public or internet source, add it to your dataset and execute the commands that you wanted to inside of the software environment. Okay, and that was everything that, yes?
Just on the short side, if I send the DataLad link to someone and they download it, once they do container run, it also downloads the
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So if you are curious on using DataLad because it was intriguing, then to get started, I would advise that you take a look at the DataLad handbook because there you can find out everything that you want without having to listen to me in your own speed and for precisely the things that you want to achieve with DataLad. It's free and open source and it's continuously developed. If you want to know something that is not yet in the handbook, you can write a request and we then see that the content gets added. And you can also, for a nice start with DataLad, check out some publicly available datasets. For example, every single dataset that is published on OpenNeuro is available as a DataLad dataset and you can obtain it onto your computer with a single command, with a single DataLad clone command. And then you can explore the looks and feels of a neuroimaging dataset yourself. The acknowledgements, DataLad is developed here by Michael Hanke and Benjamin Poldrack, as well as collaborators in the US. Joey takes care of maintaining it Annex, and there are a lot of contributors to the software. The handbook, I received help from Laura and Michael and also Lisa, who is here. And it's written by many other contributors. And if you have questions, then I'm very happy to take them.